Good afternoon. I'm Warwick Sabin, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF digital discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being part of the Society of Fellows. Your membership directly supports and sustains the work of the Aspen Institute, and that support and work is more critical now than ever before. We introduced this new digital platform to keep our community together during this challenging time, and we had a great response to our first ever digital event last week. Now, there are around 500 of you participating in this event right now from all over the nation, an incredible turnout. And I want to recognize Dan Porterfield, the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute, who is part of our audience this afternoon. If this is your first digital event with us, here are a few technical notes. There will be an opportunity to take your questions during the later part of this event, but you can submit a question at any time by clicking the Ask a Question tab, typing in your question, and then hitting Submit. If you encounter any problems during the event, please test your connection button and read through the instructions. If you have any other issues, please click the Chat Live button. You can also call or email the SOF hotline, and our team will be glad to assist you. Now, we're very honored to have Tom Friedman as our speaker for this event. In addition to filing his regular op-ed columns in the New York Times since 1995, he is the author of 7 best-selling books, including From Beirut to Jerusalem and The World is Flat. He is the recipient of 3 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 for international reporting and 1 for commentary. He joined the New York Times in 1981, serving as the paper's Beirut bureau chief and Jerusalem bureau chief before moving to Washington to be the diplomatic correspondent and then White House correspondent. Today, he will be addressing the socio-cultural implications of the global pandemic and what we can expect as it continues to wreak havoc on communities around the world. This conversation will be moderated by Elliot Gerson, Executive Vice President at the Aspen Institute for Policy Programs, Public Programs, and International Partners. Elliot and Tom will chat for the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to Tom for the rest of the event. So Elliot, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Warwick. It's great to feel like there are so many great friends in the same room. Good afternoon, Tom. Let's start close to home, literally in home. As one of the best-known travelers in the world, how are you and Anne managing and coping in isolation in Bethesda?
Well, thanks, Elliot, and my best regards to everyone in the audience, their families beyond. I hope everyone's staying safe and well. So I'm sitting here in my office. How are we coping? Anne's downstairs in her office. As some of you may know, my wife was founding a museum of words and language in Washington, D.C. called Planet Word. It was about 90% done. We're supposed to open at the very end of May. Obviously, that's been delayed. Construction's more or less on hold as well. So Anne's had a lot of issues to manage with that, obviously. I always live rather asynchronously because being a columnist, I could live and work at home and sit in kind of a cockpit and call people all over the world when I wasn't traveling. So I certainly miss the travel. I try to keep a routine. I get up every morning. I walk for 2 hours. I work. We have food. We either try to support our local restaurants and do takeout or go out and cook. My comfort food is I occasionally buy a giant supermarket birthday cake. I'm addicted to giant birthday cakes. And every night we watch Gilmore Girls from the very beginning. I'm a huge Gilmore Girls fan. My 2 girls used to watch it with Anne. They'd sit in one chair together. So we're rewatching the entire series of Gilmore Girls, and it's such a wonderful story about a community, and then I go to bed and start over the next day.
Well, we may have another one of these conversations devoted to the Gilmore Girls. For now, we're going to be discussing broad issues and topics in global politics, global culture, changes in society. We're not going to be talking specifically about public health policy or economic policy. And for those in this virtual room, if you haven't seen it, you should read Tom's open letter to the president, which was published in the New York Times just a few days ago. So let's start with geopolitics, and particularly something that you've often written about, Tom, and that's U.S. global leadership. What does American leadership look like now during this global catastrophe? And what do you think it will look like when we emerge? And I'd like you to, in particular, comment about that leadership vis-a-vis China. China is now sending ventilators, masks, and other protective equipment to Europe, developing countries all around the world. We don't even have enough for ourselves. So talk to us a little bit about the U.S. leadership position. We led in the Ebola crisis. What does it look like now, and what do you foresee?
Well, let me just make first a general observation, Elliot, and then we'll talk about how American leadership is or isn't, fitting into that. In the 2008 financial crisis, Warren Buffett famously observed, when the tide goes out, you see who's wearing a bathing suit. And I would say the same applies to this crisis, only at a much broader scale. That what this global pandemic reveals is many things. It reveals the quality of your governance, the quality of your healthcare system, the strength of your social compact, strength of your communities, the amount of social trust in your society, the health of your companies. And what you see around the world is this incredible stress test, which we talked about in 2008, applying to banks, now broadly applying to almost every aspect of every society. And what you see is that there are autocratic governments that have actually managed quite well. I point to the UAE, for instance, seem to have been very far ahead on this. And autocratic governments that have really fumbled, Turkey, and Egypt, for instance, have really struggled here. Egypt arrested and, in effect, evicted a Guardian reporter for reporting that the government's data on coronavirus spread there was erroneous. So those are really bad responses. You see democracies that have, I think, responded very well. Denmark. You see democracies that have struggled, our own. You see sort of autocratic regimes like Singapore, Hong Kong, regimes in between, sometimes doing very well. And so what this stress test is revealing is, one, the quality of your governance and social contract. It's also revealing things about culture. I wrote about this in my first column. My friend Michelle Gelfand from the University of Maryland writes about tight and loose cultures. Tight cultures are tend to be obedient, rule-abiding, orderly. Loose cultures, less so in every regard. And tight cultures do very well and are doing for the most part, doing well in this crisis. We see that with the Asian countries. Loose cultures, Italy, the United States, much less so. So to talk about American leadership, it has to be in that broad context of how this problem is manifesting itself. Now, historically, what did we always count on in terms of American leadership? What did the world count on? They counted on three things. One, we would lead. We would organize whatever response there was. The second is we would help. We would provide aid and comfort to people, or military support in the case of World War I, World War II. And third, that we would be a source of scientific knowledge, the best scientific knowledge in the world. And I would say we are missing in action on all three. We have not led. Trump's most boastful act is that he stopped the incoming flights from China, but it was very much every person for themselves, every country for themselves. We certainly haven't led as a government in terms of the scientific response. And on aid, we are a taker, not a donor. We're a seeker of aid. And so what will all this mean in the, I divide the world between AC and BC, before Corona and after Corona, because we are living through a seminal event. And it will change many, many things. I hope it's over sooner so it changes fewer things, but it will change many things. And what American leadership will look like after this, Elliot, I simply don't know. It will depend in what shape we are as a country to help ourselves, let alone help anyone else, and how the world looks. I would be a little careful, though, about sort of passing off global leadership to China yet. There's a little bit of trolling going on with the Chinese. We're giving you aid. They kind of like that. They've got huge problems themselves. They got huge challenges themselves. So right now it's kind of a leaderless world.
So let's just go to some of the countries you mentioned as we move around looking at the incredible implications of this. You mentioned Spain and Italy, for example, and they're both, suffering catastrophic and heartbreaking losses. Europe generally, Brexit seems like it was eons ago, another century, but, UK started late, now in lockdown. Germany, for some reason, has a much lower death rate than other countries. What do you see happening post-crisis in Europe? Do you see greater unity, greater disunity?
Well, their only salvation ultimately would be greater unity, because the EU came together for reasons of geopolitical and geoeconomic logic that do not go away. Geopolitically, this was a continent that plunged itself into 2 world wars. And that was the original reason for coming together in the small EU and then ultimately expanding it. And economically, they're the world's biggest market and have a common currency. And they can only grow their way out of that if they don't break that up, I would argue, ultimately. So I don't see that really changing so much. The real question is, like, we're now in an abnormal world. I think we're going to go to the new abnormal. And ultimately, let's hope we get to the normal. So what will the new abnormal look like if we actually are able to ultimately at least suppress this and resume some form of normal commerce and daily life? I think that is a world where between the new normal will require a vaccine. A normal world will require a vaccine. To get from where we are, this abnormal world, to a vaccine world is going to require a bridge, and that will be technological. So just as after 9/11, the big question was, I want to know that your picture on your ID matches your ticket, because I want to know if you're sitting next to me, you're on an airplane, you're not a terrorist. In the post-crisis moment, as we get out of this crisis and try to get to a new abnormal, I'm going to want to know your health record. I don't want to sit next to you on a bus. I don't want to sit next to you in a restaurant. I don't want to sit next to you on an airplane without being assured that you're not a carrier of the virus, not a terrorist, that you're a carrier of the virus. That's what I'm going to want to know now. And we're seeing an explosion right now as we speak of digital apps. There are already people who are involved in apps. I think it's called Kinsa is one of them, where their temperature is taken and sent to the cloud every day. I think that's going to get really refined. I think it will involve tracking. I think there will be huge civil liberties questions over this, just as there were after 9/11 about tracking your phone and tracking people coming into the country. But we're headed for, I would argue, a huge civil liberties tracking debate. That is the only way we can get from shelter in place to a world of vaccine and still be able to function, because it's going to require a level of trust. Who are you? What is your temperature? That will be a new greeting.
Well, let's just talk for a second about Russia in the new abnormal. Just 10 days ago, Putin said everything was under control. Obviously, it wasn't. Their crisis is accelerating. What should we be concerned about there with respect to, for example, disinformation, taking advantage of global vulnerability, cybersecurity?
Well, let me put this again in a broader context, because this virus hit in a broader context. What was the broader context? So the broader context was after World War II, the world broke up actually into 190 different nation states. Now, that actually was never how the world was governed. If you think about it historically, the world was historically governed for millennia by empires: Greek Empire, Roman Empire, Mongol Empire, Ottoman Empire, British Empire, etc. And it was only after decolonization, World War I, World War II, we broke up into 190 different countries. And the 50 years after World War II, Elliot, were a fantastic time to be a weak little country. Oh my God, if you were a weak little country, that was your era. Why? First of all, there were two superpowers throwing money at you, sending you foreign aid, sending you wheat, educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow or Wichita State in America. You could be Syria and lose 3 wars to Israel and get your army rebuilt for free all 3 times, okay? It was a good world, okay, number one. Number 2, populations were very moderate. Number 3, climate change was very moderate. Number 4, no one had one of these things to check on the leader next door, let alone the country, and see Paris. And lastly, China was not in the World Trade Organization. So everybody could be in the low-wage textile business. My argument is all that flipped in the early 21st century. Now, no superpower wants to touch you because all they win is a bill. You know, no, thanks. We don't do that anymore. Number 1. Number 2, climate change is now hammering some of these countries. 3, populations have exploded in many of them in the developing world. 4, everyone has a cell phone, and they have human trafficking apps on them now. And lastly, China's in the World Trade Organization, so nobody could be in the textile business. So before the pandemic hit, what was happening is a lot of these weak little states were actually beginning to fray and fracture, and they were hemorrhaging their people. In our hemisphere, it was Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Across the ocean, it was sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Syria, Libya. We cracked some of them just cracked on their own. And what this was doing was dividing the world into a world of order and a world of disorder. And the biggest geopolitical thing happening in the world was people trying to get out of the world of disorder into the world of order, fundamentally changing the politics of the world of order, creating all these populist nationalist backlashes. So that was going on the eve of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, what it is going to do is absolutely exacerbate that problem. States that were fracturing could literally dissolve. What's going to happen in a place like Syria? The only hope for these places is going to be herd immunity. There's no hospital. People don't even, in many places, have clean water to wash their hands, let alone find a doctor. By the way, it's going to be a huge problem in a place like India. Crowded. Modi sent everybody home to the villages again. No doctors, no ability to wash hands consistently, very crowded. So I'm really worried that this kind of post 1945 world, there's a lot of states that may, if this goes on, if they can't survive the herd immunity, which is going to be just terrible and tragic, which is basically everybody gets it. Once about 60% of the population gets it, they have herd immunity, but the elderly, the immune weak are just going to die because there will not be medical services for them. It's going to incredibly stress out these states. And therefore, the movement from the world of disorder to the world of order, I think, will be amplified. And by the way, the world of order ain't in such great shape right now. So we're going to have to go through that phase before we can really think of what does the new Europe look like.
So let's just continue a little bit about these trends and what they're going to mean. And yes, the consequences could be catastrophic for what you describe as the weaker countries, countries with poor health infrastructure and the like. But you've also talked about nationalism and autocracy and strong governments. What we're going to have post-crisis is going to be beyond just pandemic. We're also going to be in a deep recession or possibly worse with long consequences. And you think about the Great Depression, you know, it led to FDR, but it also led to Hitler. How do you see this all developing in terms of what we've seen recently in the rise of nationalism and illiberalism and autocracy, those trends against the liberal democratic regimen and structure that, you know, we cherish in the West? How do you see that's going to play out?
So I was got up early this morning. I was watching CNBC's Squawk Box because I wanted to see the unemployment numbers, and they came out at 8:30. And before they came out, they said the consensus estimate among economists was, I think it was 3.1 million new filings for unemployment. Came in at over 6.6 million. That's just a staggering number. And so a debate that started and that I was actually involved in early on in the first weeks of this, I think is going to come roaring back in the next week or so. And unfortunately, the way, because when the president jumped into it, he did it, frankly, in a crude way. And so the debate got presented as economy versus health. The debate is, how do we maximize both? How do we have a strategy here which allows us to save as many people as we can in the near term, quarantine as many people who will be vulnerable, the elderly and the immune compromised, for the long term, but begin to phase back into the economy as quickly as possible on the basis of testing so we can get the economy back going again. Elliot, that debate is going to explode in the next few days, I would argue, given these figures, because companies are just going to be going under. Your local shop, whether it's your dry cleaner, your favorite restaurant, and this is just going to be terrible. So, and it's an excruciating choice, you know. So that's going to shape a lot of it. Now, what I would say is this politically. What my hope is, I can just tell you what my hope. I would never venture a prediction. You know, Joe Biden has said he intends to appoint a woman as vice president, and Lord knows it's a wonderful sentiment. But I think he should have a different priority. I think he needs to appoint a Republican as vice president. I'll tell you why. So, and if it's a Republican woman, even better, okay? But he needs to appoint a Republican. I'll tell you why. So I follow Israeli politics very closely, and I've had a saying for a long time that the Israeli Arab conflict is to wider trends in civilization what off-Broadway is to Broadway. Well, I always follow what's going on there because it comes to Broadway, starting with airline hijacking and suicide bombing and building a wall. And I can give you a lot of examples. What's playing off Broadway right now? An Israeli national unity government, a polity that was deeply divided politically, so divided it had to go through 3 elections and still couldn't form a government. And in the end, Benny Gantz, the leader of the opposition, basically said, for sake of God and country, I'm going to join this government with Bibi Netanyahu. I believe we are going to need a Lincoln-like team of rivals, a national unity government with a Republican vice president, because the fight over equity after the smoke clears from this, and God knows, Lord, I hope it's soon, but can you imagine the fight over who got and who gets bailed out and who didn't? And if that ends up as a blue-red fight, story in Politico yesterday that Trump sent a bunch of ventilators to Florida, you know, because someone was quoted in the article from the White House and in Politico saying that's because Florida is important for his reelection. Can you imagine what this country will? You want to see civil war? We are headed for an incredible fight over who gets bailed out and how. And we have to do this as a country with a national unity government as equitably as we possibly can. That's why I would love to see Joe Biden name his team of rivals right now, or as soon as possible, or well before, you know, the election. And it's got to be the best of the best. You know, I live in Maryland, and our government here, Larry Hogan's been fantastic. He's a Republican. I voted for him. He's done a wonderful job ahead of the curve. And I don't know who it is, and if there's a Republican woman, even better. But we need a national unity government when this is over. And that's why Donald Trump must not be reelected, because every instinct in his body, every natural instinct is to lie, divide, and impugn expertise. And it's only barely suppressed right now. And if we have 4 years of him trying to manage this kind of social stress, it will be a nightmare.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. I think everybody at this time of where we've seen such hyper-partisanship and vitriolic politics and red-blue and urban-rural divide, I think all of us are looking for unity in a way we may never have before. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience in just a minute, and I may want to come back to one other question about the election coming up, but you mentioned expertise or science, and you know, obviously we all know how much you've written about climate change and the existential threat that poses. I wonder if you could just say a few words about what this crisis has meant toward attitudes towards science and expertise, and if there are any lessons there or anything that portends about how in the post-corona world the world is going to look at the climate change crisis.
Well, in my column yesterday, you know, I dug up a quote from Trump in 2018 after you know, the entire U.S. government climate team plus 300 experts outside gave the president a report on the devastating effects of climate change that are in our future. And he was asked afterwards what he thought about it. He said, "I don't believe it." And asked if he'd read it, he said, "Some." Well, that same attitude toward climate change was, present in the run-up to this coronavirus crisis. And it's a complete ignoring of the power of Mother Nature and natural systems. And that's why I quoted in my column yesterday my teacher and friend Rob Watson, who always likes to say Mother Nature is just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't talk her up. You can't talk her down. You can't say, Mother Nature, I was having such a perfect, beautiful stock market. You messed it up. She's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And she always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. So do not mess with Mother Nature. And that's just what Trump was doing. So Trump has no respect for the natural world. He is obsessed with markets. And the reason we delayed so long is that he was viewing everything through the prism of the market. So if the market went up, he thought his coronavirus policy was working. And that's why you saw him actually on March, let's see, it was March 10th, when the stock market bounced back from a huge drop the day before. He actually took a chart of the market comeback, autographed it, and sent it to Lou Dobbs on Fox News Business News. And Dobbs, knucklehead that he is, actually showed it on the air. Okay, Trump taking credit for shaping the market. So he thought if the market was going up, he was doing the right thing. While he was doing that, we now know Mother Nature was silently, relentlessly, quietly, mercilessly, and exponentially spreading the virus around the country. So the idea that we would have a president who does not believe in the science administered to him, delivered to him by his own administration on climate change is reason enough for impeachment. Because remember, climate change has one big difference from pandemics. Climate change doesn't peak. Once the Antarctic and Greenland ice shelves melt, they're gone. They no longer will reflect the sun. They'll absorb the sun. They will expand and raise and heat the oceans. And we will then live with the implications of that forever. So if we have 4 more years of this kind of craziness, we are just inviting a pandemic forever. And there's no herd immunity for climate change. There's just a relentless hammering of the herd. And that's what he is inviting.
One last question, and then I'm going to turn things back to Warwick to ask of the audience, to present audience questions. Given the enormous hardship that Americans are feeling, you talked about the unemployment numbers, and they're going to get even worse. We are now experiencing if you will, a temporary safety net like the United States has never had before. What do you think attitudes will be toward safety net kind of policies? How do you think, if at all, attitudes might change from a notion that government is the problem to government is the solution? Do you think those that will see something after the urgency of the crisis that emanates from an acceptance now in this extreme crisis of the kinds of things that never could have been enacted in normal times?
You know, as I was walking on my daily walk this morning, Elliot, I was thinking of Grover Norquist and his famous statement, the anti-tax guy, that he wanted to get government down small enough so he could drown it in his bathtub. I'm just going to not say what I really think of that guy. But there are people, there was a trend within the Republican Party. By the way, you know, Reagan and Thatcher, they were all, you know, people who wanted to get government down. And George W. Bush, but they appointed excellent people. They may have wanted to get the size of government down, to deregulate, to get it out of markets, but they treated governing seriously. Do you know who the director of national intelligence is today? The director of our senior director, our senior intelligence official is the former spokesman for the UN mission, U.S. UN mission in New York, who then Trump made ambassador to Germany, where he was a towering failure. That is our director of national intelligence. And all of that so matters today. The quality of your state, the quality of your expertise. You know, I covered Obama's dealing of the Ebola crisis. That was the deep state in action. It was a president who believed in science, who could coordinate the diplomats and the military. I think it was actually Obama's greatest foreign policy achievement, and he never got any credit for it because it succeeded. Okay. And so Trump's not going to have to worry about that here. There's going to be a lot of questioning. But we so need the A team here, but we also obviously need governance. And it's a question, Elliot, how this is interpreted. You still have people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity out there, you know, spewing their venom afterwards. If Fox decides, if the Murdoch family decides they're against big government, they can mess up the brains of a lot of people on that subject. So I wish I could say, boy, we're all going to draw the right conclusions here from this. But I gave up believing that a long time ago.
Well, Tom, this has been a great pleasure. We have lots of people in the audience. They've been asking lots of questions already, and I'm going to turn things back to Warwick to present some of those to you. Thank you again. And Warwick, back to you.
Thanks, Elliot.
Thank you, Elliot. And actually, to be honest, we've had some platform issues, so I have one question in the queue right now. And then if we have time, we can go back to any questions you may have left off your list, Elliot. But Jane Woodhouse. It's fine. Jane Woodhouse asks, what will happen when the virus begins to take hold in undeveloped countries?
Yeah, Jane, you know, it's really what I was saying. It's these countries simply have no public health infrastructure. Again, think of in India, Modi basically told people living in the slums around Mumbai and Delhi and Calcutta to go back to their home villages. But you know, the WHO says a country should have basically one doctor per 1,000 people. India officially has one doctor for about 1,500 people, but that statistic is highly skewed by the fact that it has a giant middle class and a wealthy class that has proper medical care. The actual number for Indians is probably something close to 1 per 10,000. So they don't have, in many cases, sanitary water. They don't have sanitary conditions. In a incredibly densely populated country, they cannot do social distancing. And I'm afraid that it's just going to cut through these societies and until they develop herd immunity. But a lot of vulnerable people will die as a result there. If our hospital systems in New York City can't handle this, then there's no way they can in Calcutta or Mumbai.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom. Elliot, did you have other questions on your list for Tom?
I could keep on going, and I'll go on until whatever platform issues are resolved. They can be. Tom, let's go back to American politics for a second again. You know, one of the key features of American government is federalism, and we have seen real challenges to federalism during this crisis, and its strengths and its weaknesses have been laid bare. We've seen, you know, almost open warfare between the president and governors until some governors realize that they have to be as generous as possible, or they may not get the help they need for their states. We've seen in some states significant friction between mayors and governors. We've seen how we are just not organized in ways to manage what is a national, indeed a global crisis in a crisp and efficient fashion. Can you comment a little bit about federalism and how it's being experienced and what the implications may be going forward?
So, you know, obviously we can't do things the way China does top down, but we need to have the same outcomes. And so when you can't order things top down, but you have a federal system, what it requires, therefore, Elliot, is extraordinary leadership. So you would have hoped, you know, that the president would have on day one, 2 months ago, set up two committees. One is a literally 50-state war room where every governor is in the same room with FEMA, the CDC, you know, and that basically becomes the venue for all decisions about where materials go, also exchanging of information, what's working, rather than the governor of Michigan calling the governor of Maryland, how you doing? You know, you would have that group, and next to it in another room, you'd have a G20 group, where the G20 would be having, everyone would have a representative sharing the same kind of information, trying to coordinate so we don't have a global fight. Canada's prime minister just an hour ago said, hey, I think some of our ventilators were diverted from here to New York. I mean, and so if we don't organize that, nobody organizes it, and you get this kind of sort of chaotic response. So federalism is a great system for many things. It's not great for a crisis like this, absent really smart, far-reaching, firm leadership. You know, the president gave a 2-hour briefing the other night. I mean, that's madness. He should be back being briefed, running the coordination between the time he had to be briefed for the briefing and the time then he briefed. You're talking about at least 3 hours. Mm-hmm. That's madness.
Let's stay talking about the media for just a minute. You made a reference, you've made a few references to it already. You've talked about the presidential press conferences. There's now a debate about whether they should even be covered in full. Are they more like the, you know, pep rallies, political rallies, than they are really conveying critical news? How do you think the media is doing? What kind of report card would you give to the media generally, or specific segments of this during this period? Your columns are probably being read now by more people than ever before in history. But
well, yeah, no question. The New York Times, all the trusted media, whether it's the Atlantic or the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, in terms of news, Reuters, AP, I mean, all of them, people are craving navigation right now. They're craving facts, you know. And I think the media, under the circumstances, the mainstream media has done a fantastic job. I'm so proud of my own newspaper, but I'm proud of all my colleagues. We're doing it, and under really adverse circumstances. We've got reporters going into emergency wards and hospitals and cities and exposing themselves, or living in. I wrote my colleague Alyssa Rubin the other day. She's in Baghdad, writing about how there's basically no healthcare system, and I just said how much I admire you for being there, you know, and telling that story, which is a vitally important story. So, yeah, our media has never been more important. I believe it's functioning, you know, amazingly under the crisis. And you know, obviously, you know, there'll be a reckoning with Fox News and some of their personalities, Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham, and you can already see it happening. And with the Murdochs, what they enabled, how it slowed us down early on, and there'll be a reckoning, but I'll leave that to the media critics.
Let's go back to the rise of autocrats. We've seen that even before the crisis, and we now look at different autocrats operating in different ways, and their degrees of autocracy. You know, Singapore is a kind of autocracy, and they seem to have managed this crisis perhaps as well or better than anyone else. Then you contrast that with, say, what we're seeing in Brazil, in Hungary. We have a situation now where, you know, it no longer may be a democracy at all. Of course, what he wants is an illiberal democracy, but it will now just be an illiberal autocracy. How do you see this playing out?
Well, you know, I would be careful. I would say to the Orbans of the world, you know, and the autocrats who want to take advantage of this, be careful what you wish for, because this is a crisis that could be so difficult and overwhelming. Once you assume all power, you assume all responsibility. Now, some of them will obviously use this moment to externalize that responsibility, find a foreign enemy, an enemy next door. But it's going to be more and more difficult. This is such an all-encompassing crisis that I think it's the countries that build broad coalitions, bring everybody together, the way Israel chose to do, the way I'm arguing that we should do. I think those countries will be built to last, because you can't suppress the information about this pandemic. You know, governments are not used to, Elliot, dealing with Mother Nature, who has her wonderful sides too. I look out on my lawn, it's because of climate change, all the cherry trees are already out, you know. But because you can leverage chemistry, biology, and physics in wonderful ways as well. But it's not like fighting a human enemy, you know. She is relentless, and she just keeps coming at you until the physics, biology, and chemistry change. So she really doesn't care about your politics. She doesn't open at 9:30 in the morning, close at 4, take weekends off. And that kind of enemy, unless you are leveraging the right physics, biology, and chemistry to tilt her the other way through vaccines and through cures and military drugs, she's gonna run you over. And so these people who are reaching for authority right now, I think they have no idea what they're up against.
Well, let's talk about the divides in the United States a little bit and cultural trends. I mean, obviously, we have an urban-rural divide that manifests itself politically and culturally and socially in other ways. And for a while now, it almost seems that this crisis may be, if anything, exacerbating it. I mean, we have situations where in Seattle, you know, people don't move more than 60 meters or whatever I read today, whereas in Wyoming and other parts of the country, they're still traveling great distances. It was just today that the Florida governor finally put some statewide policies in effect. Do you see, given the fact that this virus is not a Republican virus, it's not a Democratic virus, it's not an urban virus, it's not a rural virus, it affects everybody. Isn't it possible that this could, I mean, there's both an optimistic way that this could, you know, create new unity, or it could exacerbate it? Where do you come out on that?
Yeah, well, you know, here's a newsflash. Mother Nature does not recognize the border between Florida and Georgia, you know, and so what the governor of Florida was doing was utterly reckless, because this virus will come for everybody. By the way, it'll come for the Panhandle. It'll come for Central Georgia. I'm from Minnesota, and I was talking to Mike Osterholm, one of our great epidemiologists at the University of Minnesota. He was making this point. It doesn't care about blue states, red states. It starts in urban areas because they're denser and more globally connected, but then it just goes out from there. And so eventually, it you know, unless you're sheltering in place and doing the proper things, it will come for everybody. And you know, the governor of Georgia today made the most remarkable statement. He said only yesterday did he understand that people who actually carried the disease could be immune and carrying it and actually convey it and shed it to others. Now, that would be a remarkable statement from any governor today, okay? Because Fauci's been talking about this for a month. But the governor of Georgia, where the CDC is headquartered, for him to make that statement it's really scary. But it shows you that, again, when the tide goes out, Elliot, you see who's not wearing a bathing suit, and you see which governor is a blithering moron. And I fear for people who are living in states. I'm blessed. Larry Hogan, our Republican governor, has just done an excellent job. And in Montgomery County, where I live, our local county, excellent job. The governor, Mike DeWine of Ohio, I think he'll be hailed as a hero when this is over. And these other knuckleheads who think that, you know, because the numbers are what they are today, that's how it's going to be, and it's static, and it would never come across the Texas-Oklahoma border. You know, it's what you get when you impugn science for so many years and you impugn expertise. You get knuckleheads, and now it's lethal.
Well, you brought up the topic of the presidential election indirectly by making a vice presidential suggestion. Let me ask some questions about that. I mean, are you concerned about how this election is going to be able to be conducted in November? What should we be doing about assuring, not just dealing with the cyber threats and the other technological challenges to the integrity of it? What if nightmare continues and no one wants to stand in line to vote in November? What should we be thinking about?
It's a huge problem, especially if the virus gets suppressed during the summer, both by what we're doing and by reasons of temperature. And I don't know that it will. I know there's a lot of division on that, but then comes back in the fall. and we still don't have a vaccine. That's why we need a vaccine so badly. And absent that, we need technological bridges that will enable people to feel comfortable going out. But I'm worried about so many things like right now that I can't quite get to November yet. I'm just worried about mass unemployment and what that will mean for people's lives, their savings, their hopes, and their futures. And that's what's really beyond just people who are sitting in hospitals right now who are clinging to life, and I just can't reach that far right now.
No, I think it's hard for all of us too, but we still think about,
somebody is.
We still think about the election, and we have to think about it. Many people have commented on, and you brought up the president. I wasn't going to. Many people have commented, including himself, on the polls and his apparent bump in popularity, although the polls are somewhat inconsistent there. How do you interpret that? I mean, how significant is it? And then, we can remember that, George Bush's numbers went up over 90% after 9/11. And I think his father's number went up over 90%, at the start of the Iraqi war. And of course, he lost a few months later. How do you, with your perspective, view, the natural, we all want to rally around the president. How should we interpret those numbers?
The remarkable thing is how low they are, not how high they are. Because the natural human instinct is to not only rally around your leader, but want to believe that he or she knows what they're doing. And so this doesn't surprise me. Look, I wrote this when I wrote my own open letter to the president. I'm rooting for him to succeed. It's never good politics to hope that your party wins only if the country fails. So I'd rather compete against Trump if I were a Democratic candidate on something other than you led us into the Great Depression, frankly. So I'm rooting for him to succeed, and let's argue about other things later. And that's why I try to be, I don't spend a lot of time in my column attacking him. I'm trying to be more constructive as I can, only because I'm as terrified as anybody about what this can mean to the future of this great country. This is a once in a century event. And this is not a time I'm playing politics. It's why I'm calling for a national unity government, when it's to lead us out of it.
You are renowned for your crystal ball in not just political context, but cultural, social ones as well. What kinds of, again, it's too early in this, and we're still sort of in shock and denial about how long we may be hunkered down in this position. But do you have any sense of some of the things that we are now doing that, that might not change in terms of, are we all going to be washing our hands in different ways and constantly in the future? Are we not going? Are our European friends not going to be kissing each other's cheeks? But those are maybe trivial examples. But what kinds of just social interchange is going to be different going forward?
One of the things I've learned the hard way, Elliot, is never say things will never be the same. And I've made that mistake. And if I've done it even in this conversation, I take it back. The reason I say that is I've been reading a lot about the 1918 pandemic, and Anne sent me, my wife sent me a story about Minneapolis and St. Paul in the 1918 pandemic, and how each city took a slightly different approach to it, but all the issues were exactly the same. But we came out of that pandemic. We had an amazing century interrupted by a terrible world war, but the world globalized. It continued to be knitted together. Our country grew, and so much depends on how long this lasts and how we navigate our way out of it. And I'm hoping for the best.
Well, you mentioned a vaccine, and we're all hoping for a vaccine. Your hope for one before November, unfortunately, is a minority hope at the moment. Yeah. Most scientists are saying it's more likely to be 18 months or maybe at least a year. But let's imagine we have a vaccine. This is a global crisis, and we're talking about billions of people. What is the proper way for governing institutions to think about how to deal with that and how to equitably make it available?
Well, that's why it's got to be done like through some kind of global committee, because first of all, we don't make vaccines in this country, the raw materials for them. So I think very few. We people don't realize we will be in line, even if it's one of our companies, because the raw materials are actually not, as I understand it, for the most part, made here. Again, that's where U.S. leadership really matters. How we apportion this out. You had Trump early on telling a German company, "I want you to come here and have the vaccine done here, so we get it all." That's just not gonna. That's not gonna work. And so, it's why we need this bridge to a vaccine, and why we need some kind of global coordination, and that'd be done in some equitable basis.
Well, I don't know what kind of technical issues we're having, Warwick, if you're on, but we're coming. Do we have any audience questions, or shall we be thinking of wrapping this up?
Well, Elliot, I think yeah, we've actually gone over our time, so it's probably time for me to close things out. But I do want to thank you and Tom. Tremendous conversation, terrific insights. I know everyone really appreciated the discussion, and we're also going to share the recording of it. And this will live on, but a very important moment in time. And thank you both for joining our community of the Society of Fellows today for this conversation. I want to remind everybody who is still with us that we have several digital discussions coming up in the near future. Next week on April 7th, Nancy Lazar, who's the Global Chief Economist and co-founder of Cornerstone Macro, will be presenting on economic shock and awe for the global stimulus. On April 17th, we'll have Lori Gottlieb, the Atlantic columnist, writer, and psychotherapist, joining us. And then on April 22nd, Kyle Drop, who co-founded and is the Chief Research Officer for Morning Consult, will be with us to talk about measuring public opinion amid this pandemic. So again, to Tom, to Elliot, thank you very much for this presentation. To everyone who joined us, thank you for being with us. We hope you stay healthy and safe, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.